Good evening, I'm James McPherson, filling in for Andrew Bolt, who is back next week. We're being warned Australia is in the midst of an anti-fossil fuels war with our energy security at risk. We'll speak to National Senator Matt Canavan. Violence erupts in a remote Indigenous town in the Northern Territory. We'll get all of the latest on that. A US court has finally released new documents naming more than 150 people associated with notorious sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. And how woke is too woke? Wait till you see Disney's latest controversial hire for its new Star Wars film. It's safe to say the Force is not with them. But first, the ACT government is about to introduce the most liberal euthanasia laws in Australia. Unlike in other Australian jurisdictions, there'll be no life expectancy requirements. So in the ACT, if you're terminally ill, you'll be eligible for assisted suicide, whether you have 12 months or 12 years to live. Not only that, but nurses, social workers and counsellors will, for the first time in Australia, be allowed to initiate a conversation about euthanasia. Can you imagine? You're terminally ill, feeling like a burden on your family, understandably afraid, maybe depressed, and your social worker says, "Have you considered dying? Not down the track, I mean now. We can arrange that for you." How dare the state allow its officers to put suicide in the minds of vulnerable people? I always wondered what might follow the nanny state. I never imagined it would be the execution state. Oh, stop being so dramatic, James, I hear you say. Hey, I'm not the one green-lighting social workers to offer death as a solution to people's problems. Next, the ACT Labor Greens government will bring in death duties just to, complete the circle. That's a joke, I hope. But it gets worse. As radical as the ACT legislation is, the Territory's 3 taxpayer-funded human rights commissioners want it to go even further. A submission from the ACT Human Rights Commission revealed in the Australian Today argues that restricting euthanasia to people over the age of 18 amounts to, wait for it, discrimination. The Territory's Human Rights Commissioner, Children and Young People Commissioner, and Discrimination, Disability, Health and Community Services Commissioner have all argued... Hang on, I just got to stop for a second. Why does the ACT, with a population not much larger than the Sunshine Coast, have a Human Rights Commissioner, a Children's Commissioner and a Discrimination Commissioner? The ACT government is a glorified local council with 3 Human Rights Commissioners, all on the taxpayer teat, whose big idea is, let's make it easier for minors to die. Anyway, all of these taxpayer-funded commissioners have argued that children have the right to, quote, voluntarily end their life with dignity in the same circumstances as adults. Any restriction would infringe upon a young person's right to health care, they say. They want to call assisted suicide health care and in the same breath expect us to trust them with our children. They want me to believe vulnerable people will never be manipulated into ending their lives. They can't even make the argument without manipulating the language. As for the claim that banning minors from euthanasia amounts to discrimination, well, that's the kind of argument my teenagers would make. Incidentally, boys, if you're watching, and you better be, I expect your rooms to be clean when I get home. We don't allow minors to order a beer. Is that a breach of their human rights? We don't allow minors to drive a car. Is that a violation of their humanity? We don't allow minors to marry. Is that discrimination? We don't allow 14-year-olds to consent to sex. But the ACT Human Rights Commissioners, 3 of them, want to allow 14-year-olds to consent to their own deaths. We don't allow children to exercise many rights that are available to adults, and the reason is children are not adults. Now, no one's got any wish to see teenagers in pain, but generally, teenagers don't have the maturity to make wise decisions about most things, least of all, something as final as assisted suicide. Does this really need to be explained? I mean, you'd have to be an ACT Human Rights Commissioner not to understand something so obvious. ACT Chief Minister Andrew Barr has said the government will wait 3 years before looking at whether minors should be eligible for assisted suicide. In other words, let's get this legislation passed first, and then once the noise has all subsided, we'll casually announce that we're going to allow teens to be euthanised. In 3 years' time, they'll call it a reform, rather than what it really is, a radically, highly irresponsible, crazy-ass decision that you'd expect in Justin Trudeau's Canada, rather than in Australia. Oh, there's no slippery slope, they promise, always gently nudging us closer and closer to the edge. Well, another big news day. Let's get across all of the stories with Sky News contributor Joe Hildebrand. Joe, let's start with what I've just spoken about, teenagers accessing euthanasia. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's deeply concerning. I couldn't agree with you more, James. I have issues, maybe it's just a sort of Irish Catholic blood in me, but I have serious reservations about euthanasia generally. I have no problem with very, shall we say, aggressive palliative care, making sure that they're comfortable. And that goes on all the time in hospitals and hospices right around the country, and it doesn't need a piece of paper or a bit of legislation to codify when someone should be allowed to die. And the concern I have is simply, as you say, it starts off as, only people over the age of 18, then suddenly that's unfair to teenagers. It starts off as, you can only have 6 months to live, then it's 12 months to live. Then is it a chronic condition? It starts off just with physical conditions, and then is it mental conditions? Is it Alzheimer's? Is it people who are suffering from depression and want to die? What about people who are suffering from bipolar and want to die some days and want to live others? Do you just catch them on an off day or during an off patch? And if that patch lasts a certain amount of time, then that's it. And the biggest problem, I think, is that once you put on the table that dying is an option, that it is not the human default position to live and to want to live, then suddenly that forces people, I think, to reevaluate their right to be on this earth, how much of a burden they are. Certainly there would be a generation of Australians, a generation of people who would perhaps not want to die and be scared of dying, but be mindful that, they have their children looking after them, their loved ones looking after them, and feel like they might be a burden on them and think, well, I'll do it for them. They've got enough on their plate. I think we all know some people who think like that, selfless people who think like that, who might feel unduly, silently pressured to do it, or might feel like it is the right thing to do. And you might not even know that they have any reservations about it. And all these concerns are more just well up in my mind. But honestly, the idea that you would extend this to teenagers whose brains are still developing is absolutely insane. And it is, I think, quite mortifying, but also quite illuminating that it's come from the seat of our national government.
Good point. Only in Canberra, where they're decriminalising dangerous drugs and doing all sorts of other crazy things. Hey, I want to ask you about the big news today, and that is, of course, the unsealing of those documents naming more than 150 people associated with notorious sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. The names: Bill Clinton, Prince Andrew, Michael Jackson, David Copperfield. A lot of these people, of course, are very high profile, but they might not have done anything wrong. So is there now this danger of guilt by association? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I certainly, the notion of guilt by association, I think, is one that is held most strongly by terrorists and the puritanical left. The puritanical left will say, it's the company you keep. So, they'll say prime ministers shouldn't have shaken Donald Trump's hand when he was the president of the United States, for the love of God. And then, of course, you also have terrorists who say, an American bombed my country, therefore I will kill another American because they are both American, and so that's fair enough. And again, it's that thing where you punish people just because of what they might be or who they might have met or where they might live, rather than by anything they have done. Again, I have to say, though, this is a bit of a fizzer. I looked at the number one story on the BBC website when it was the BBC World website when it was reporting this, and shock horror. The number one story of the day was Prince Andrew named as associate of Jeffrey Epstein. Well,
right?
Didn't we already know this? Again, Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, both of them were known to have been associates. Clinton was known to have flown on his plane. There's of course no allegation of any wrongdoing. So you would kind of argue, well, if there's no allegation of any wrongdoing, then what is the point that's being made? I think, of course, court processes have to be transparent and have to be available to the public unless they're incredibly pressing reasons not to. And I would think matters of life and death. But
Joe, doesn't that raise the question? Because you're right, it was a bit of a fizzer, but that begs the question: why did people fight so hard to keep this from the public domain for so many years?
Yeah, exactly right. And again, there's the cliche that you and I and anyone in journalism and politics would know, is that it's never the crime, it's always the cover-up that gets you. And so there would be plenty of people here, I imagine, whose names were on this list, who fought to have their names suppressed, who just by the fact of being on this list don't appear to be guilty or have any clout over them, but the fact that they fought so hard not to be identified makes you think, oh, hang on a minute, maybe there was something there. But
that's exactly right. Exactly
again,
right.
Pull back the rug, let the sunshine in. That's what I always say.
Hey, Joe, I want to talk about aged care. I'll let viewers decide whether you're closer to the nursing home or me. But what do you think about the suggestion wealthier people should pay more for their aged care? Is that fair, or is that, robbing people who have paid their taxes all their lives and now they've got to pay for their nursing home as well?
Yeah, look, it's one of those ones, and it's something I touched on earlier with the euthanasia question. In principle, I don't like it because I think I'm usually in favour of means testing when it comes to things like, for example, say, education, where, people who go to university get the benefits of a university degree, get the benefits of a higher income as a result of that. They, I think it's fair enough, should repay through HEX or whatever other scheme that's followed, that they should be required to pay a proportion of that, and that it's unfair for the taxes of working class people to go towards the education of people who are already earning more money than them as a result of the benefits that working class person has paid for them. So that kind of, basically poor people subsidising rich people, I'm not sure if I'm all in favour of that. And the problem I have, though, with the aged care stuff, and again, I think in practice it's probably something that actually has to be done, it has to be looked at, just because aged care is getting so unaffordable, and you've got taxpayers basically paying for well over 90% of it, whereas people who might have multi-million-dollar homes get taxed or have paid the same amount as someone who might have a $300,000 home. So I think there are practicalities there that need to be fixed. But again, you don't want to create a situation where aged care providers, perhaps perversely, start to favour people with larger incomes or larger reserves of cash or property, because they think, well, they're the cash cow, they're the ones we can gouge the most money out of, which again could perversely harm people who don't have those resources, who might find themselves waiting for a space, waiting for a place a lot longer than those who can afford to monkey up the cash.
All right, let me talk to you about one more thing before we finish our conversation, and that's border control. Obviously, there's been a lot of doubt about this government's ability to control the borders. Now there's new figures showing the number of asylum seekers arriving by plane. So we don't have boats, but we've got planes, and the number of asylum seekers arriving on a plane has doubled since Anthony Albanese came to power. Now, most of these people don't come from war-torn countries. What they're doing is coming to Australia on a tourist or a business visa, and then when they get here, they apply for asylum. Is this a sign that asylum seekers think the government is weak on borders? And is this a problem we've got that is hidden because it's not boats on our TV screens, it's aircraft arriving at Sydney Airport every other day and we don't realise?
Yeah, well, if it is a problem, it's a curiously bipartisan one, because this is the exact same allegation that Labor in opposition tried to level against the coalition when it was in government, bragging about the fact that it stopped the boats. And of course, you had, I think it was Opposition Home Affairs spokeswoman Christine Keneally when she was around saying, yeah, but what about plane arrivals? They're through the roof. I don't think it's as big a problem. Firstly, there's not much point just looking at the volume of asylum seekers without looking at the proportion who have actually been granted asylum. So it may be that there's a whole bunch of people who've come here on tourist or business or whatever visas, education visas, and are trying to game the system. But if they are not actually being granted asylum, then obviously that is far less of an issue for Australia, for Australian migration levels, for the taxpayer, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's the first kind of beat-up element.
Well, the problem, Joe, the problem is that once they get here, and most of them are not eventually granted asylum, but they're here for years because the system takes so long,
process, that's right,
and they're clogging up the system.
That is certainly an issue, but again, it is preferable still, and I would have said this is the beauty of being so fair and balanced as I always am. I said this at the time when it was levelled against the coalition government, that these are at least people who have documentation, whose names and details and identities are known. That was not always, or rarely even, the case when boat arrivals came over, and so Of course, the security risk was much, much higher. Even their ages were unknown. We had that process where, you were wrist scanning, I think it was, where you'd scan the wrists of asylum seekers to find out if they were children or not, to find out how old they were, because there was absolutely nothing else to identify them, their age, let alone their name. So I think it's a much lower risk. It is obviously a burden that we do not want, because I support higher levels of people being resettled here from proper UN refugee camps. There's already a big surplus of card-carrying, accredited, bona fide refugees who are languishing in camps around the Middle East and Africa. You're absolutely right, Joe. We should be taking them, not people who have the wiles and the money to chance it by arriving here and then pleading asylum later.
You're absolutely right. The fair and balanced Joe Hildebrand. I appreciate your time tonight. Well, the CEO of one of Australia's biggest gas companies has called out the government's lack of forward thinking when it comes to energy. Santos CEO Kevin Gallagher says Australia is in the midst of a, quote, anti-fossil fuels war with our energy security at risk. Joining me now is National Senator Matt Canavan. Matt, thanks for your time. Kevin Gallagher says we have two problems in this country: energy security and energy affordability. On energy security, he says, we can't turn the taps off on oil and gas before there are replacement technologies. Now, you and I both know that's true, but that's exactly what this government is doing.
Well, that's what they want to do. They say they're trying to do that. I mean, it's still the case that almost every evening and morning, around 80% of our power comes from coal and gas, and even across the full 24 hours, about 60% across the country, a bit higher here in Eastern Australia, comes from fossil fuels, comes from coal and gas. I mean, we just simply can't do without it, or to do without it would mean we would radically change how we live. We wouldn't be able to cool our homes, we wouldn't have constant electricity all the time, and some people are discovering how difficult that is during these storms. It's horrible for people. And guess what people do? And I know a few people have been without power for a long time, some more than a week since these storms. The first thing people do is to go and try and get as many petrol, diesel generators as they can,
right,
and get those lovely fossil fuels back powering their homes. And geez, they're relieved when that happens, and that's what the rest of the world wants. The rest of the world wants energy just like ourselves, and that's why demand for coal, for gas is going through the roof. Kevin Gallagher here is just speaking common sense. Unfortunately, that is in short supply. It's not very common among this government, and they're doing great harm to our own energy security, affordability, and ultimately our strength as a nation. If we can't supply our energy, we'll be a much weaker nation for it.
So that's energy supply. On the issue of energy affordability, or should I say unaffordability, here's the proof. We had energy retailers yesterday saying they need to hike power prices again, and this is the reason. They say we've rushed too quickly into solar. Can you just simply explain that for me and what's going on there?
Well, one of the problems here is we're not imposing all of the costs of renewable energy on the users or investors in that technology. So it sometimes can make quite rational sense for people to put solar panels on their roofs when they face a high average tariff across the day. The residential consumer only pays a single tariff no matter when they use their power. The problem now is that we've got so much solar in some states that the worth of that power is very, very low. In fact, sometimes prices are going negative, or very, very small or low prices. And that might seem like a good thing, but the problem is it is deterring investment across the rest of the day, because the coal-fired power stations, the gas-fired power stations can't make any money during the middle of the day. They've got to jack up their prices in the evening, and it's bringing forward the retirements of those power stations. So we've got a mismatch here between what the value of power is to the grid, to society, and what people are either paying for it or the benefit they're getting from it by producing at those times. There has been way too much solar encouraged by government subsidies, and now we have the absurd situation where the energy regulator has to step in many times any given season and effectively restrict the amount of renewables that are in the system to keep the grid stable.
Well, Matt, while coal is being demonised, we can't use it for much longer, it's bad, it's evil. I tell you someone who wants our coal desperately, and that's Ukraine. A month ago, the Ukrainian ambassador here in Australia asked our government to send coal to help them get through the winter. They're still waiting for a response. What on earth is going on there? I thought we were trying to help Ukraine, but apparently when it comes to coal, we're very, very slow. We haven't even replied yet.
Well, what is going on? We talk a big game, and the government talks a big game wanting to support Ukraine here. I was shocked to hear that it's been a month to get a response from us, and we're the world's largest coal exporter, or we vie with Indonesia for that mantle every other year. So we've got lots of resource to give here. This is the request from the Ukrainian government to ourselves. When that request came through to a previous Liberal national government, we acted. We organised some coal. At the time, the Minister Keith Pitt helped organise a delivery of coal from Whitehaven from an Australian coal producer to help Ukraine. And if this request has come in, I think the Albanese government's got a lot of questions to answer here. Are they putting their own internal politics ahead of the global security of Eastern Europe and indeed the world here? Because, look, we can have our arguments about where coal's going to be in 20 or 50 years and whether we need to transition. But clearly we need to help Ukraine now. And we need to put aside all these ridiculous ideological arguments around coal or gas and do what's necessary to help this state under attack, this democratic state under attack. So someone's got to ask the Albanese government, the Prime Minister here, what is going on? Why hasn't your government responded to Ukraine about this request, given the resources we have and the capabilities of the Australian government clearly to organise these deliveries, just as the previous government did?
Do you think if the Ukrainians had said, please send us solar panels, our government would have responded faster?
Oh, no doubt about it. Although the funny thing with that, of course, is we couldn't give them any because we don't make them here. We'd have to buy them from China, so they could have just gone straight to the source. But we do have coal. We have something we can give, something of value that people want, so we should help.
Hey, just quickly before we go, an exclusive story by my colleague Caroline Marcus. Qantas cabin crew members caught wearing pro-Palestinian badges while serving passengers on a flight. The Jewish community is furious. I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I don't begrudge anyone having their own different political views, but this is the problem when you start introducing politics into business. I think Qantas have to bear the blame for this, because if they're going to go around and promote their own corporate agenda through gay marriage debates, through the voice referendum, it's a bit hard or rich for them to tell their staff then that, hey, pull your heads in on your own political agendas. And where does this end? Because then you're going to have people with Israeli flags and the same cabin crew. I mean, I think people just want an airline to take them from A to B as cheaply and as safely as possible. I don't need politics forced down my throat with the cabin instruction manual at the start of the airplane. Just take off and land for me and get that done properly.
Matt Canavan, really appreciate your time. Thank you. Well, after the break, shocking violence is erupting once again in a remote Indigenous town in the Northern Territory. More about that after this. Well, it was only 12 months ago that out-of-control violence in Alice Springs shocked all of us. Videos of young teens walking about with machetes, stealing cars, breaking into houses, shops were vandalised and damaged. Now, alcohol restrictions were put in place, but now violence is once again surging in another remote community, this time in Wadare, south of Darwin. Cars have been set alight, police vehicles rammed, there are reports of large-scale fighting with weapons, and there's even reports of people being shot with arrows. Joining me now is Sky News Darwin Bureau Chief Matt Cunningham. Matt, you know these communities well. What's behind this latest surge in violence? I understand this is a community of about 2,000 people.
That's right, James. Wadare is actually the largest remote Indigenous community in the Northern Territory. It's in the West Daly region. It's about 400 kilometres southwest of Darwin, but it is a community with an interesting history, and it is made up of 21 different clan groups. So, I mean, for as long as I've lived in the Northern Territory, you know, the fighting has never been too far away in this area. Now, 2 years ago, we saw, and you can see it in this vision now, some of that fighting really flare up, some serious rioting in Wadare. There were more than 100 homes in that community that were either damaged or destroyed at the time, and about 2 years ago there was also a young man who was killed during some of that fighting. Now, what we're seeing now is a flare-up again of those tensions. There are some payback issues. There are rival gangs in that community that police have for years been trying to keep under control, and we are seeing these issues flare up again now. We heard from police just yesterday that there had been more serious unrest in the community of Wadare. They have sent the Territory Safety Division, a new high visibility police unit to that community, but they really are struggling to keep things under control out there at Wadare at the moment.
You mentioned that this is not the first time we've had problems in this community. A couple of years ago when, did you say 100 homes were destroyed. And I think those homes had to be rebuilt at the cost of taxpayers to the tune of about $10 million, didn't they? So there's a number of strands to this story. There's the violence, which we don't want to see because we don't want to see anybody getting hurt. But then this also becomes a big issue for taxpayers who've got to come in and clean up the damage.
Yeah, it was quite extraordinary, the amount of damage that was done throughout 2022 and last year as that fighting took place. I was out there in Qatar about a month or so ago, James. I mean, there was a mixed view about how things were going in the community at that time. Some people I spoke to, some elders, were saying that really the trouble was continuing. The government was trying to put a more positive spin on things, saying it was somewhat under control. But I think, as you've seen in the past few days, really things are always simmering close to the surface there in Qatar, and we've seen that boil over again. We're also seeing it in nearby communities, including Daly River and the other community of Pepperminardi. We've seen some quite disturbing things happen. There's a group of young men out at Pepperminardi who call themselves the Jovi Boys, and they've been actually driving into Darwin. There have been several incidents where they drive into Darwin from Pepperminardi. They steal cars. There've been instances where they've actually gone and raided camping stores and stolen crossbows and the like from those type of stores, and then used them in some of the violence that's taken place back out there in the West Daly region. So, I mean, there's a difficult issue for police to try and get on top of. There are all sorts of issues contributing to this. One of them are the cultural issues. One of them is the warring that's gone on for a long time between rival clan groups out there. And the other issue is alcohol. Now, police say they put roadblocks in place to try to divert the alcohol. What is a dry community. And they say that they've been able to intercept some of those people trying to run grog into that community. But that's another issue that's really adding to the trouble that we're seeing out there at the moment.
Alice Springs, of course, as I mentioned in the introduction, had all sorts of problems 12 months ago. Just what's going on in Alice Springs now? Have things really calmed down there, or are we just not hearing about it, but the same problems continue to exist there as well?
Well, I'll probably be able to give you a better idea next week, because I'll be on the ground there in Alice Springs. But things, I think, are starting to get out of control again in Alice Springs. The Police Commissioner, Michael Murphy, today said that there'd been 17 cars stolen there in 7 days. There was another report just 2 days ago of the local KFC there that was broken into at 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, the guy who manages the KFC, he went there at 3 o'clock in the morning. He couldn't get into his own store. He rang 000 and he said he was told by the operator at 000 not to go into town in Alice Springs because of the number of stolen cars that were being driven around in a dangerous manner in the town at that time. So I think that there was things probably improved a little bit after Anthony Albanese's visit there last January. I think the most important thing that happened when the Prime Minister visited there 12 months ago was that he forced the Northern Territory government to reinstate alcohol bans in Alice Springs town camps. But, I mean, this is traditionally a time of the year where those issues flare up in Alice Springs. It's the summer period. It's a period where a lot of people come in to Alice Springs from surrounding communities. And so I think the police are going to have their work cut out again, trying to keep on top of this problem this summer.
Matt, just quickly, you mentioned police. Obviously, you're in and around talking to people. What's the attitude of police like in terms of their morale? I mean, how do they cope with this continual violence and problems in communities? Because, I mean, they're getting targeted. We've got stories in Qatar of police cars being rammed, the police station being rammed.
And we had the Assistant Commissioner, Travis Worst, come out just yesterday and plead with the community in Qatar not to attack police. There were 6 people who were arrested, 3 adults and 3 youths in Qatar, for ramming police vehicles and ramming the police station. There was another woman who was arrested for assaulting police. So it does make it very difficult for police to do their job. I would say that over the past few years, James, police morale in the Northern Territory has been at an all-time low. I think it's probably improved somewhat in the past 6 months. We've got a new police commissioner, Michael Murphy. He's a local. He's someone who's worked in the Territory for a long time. He's someone who appears, I would say, to have the respect of most of the rank and file police officers. But there is a tough task ahead rebuilding police morale, which has been really battered here in the Northern Territory over the past few years. And you can only imagine what it is like for those officers who have to front up day and night and confront some of these shocking scenes and try and deal with this. I'd say it's one of the toughest jobs in the country, being a police officer in the Northern Territory right now.
Well, Matt, we appreciate you updating us, and we look forward to hearing your updates from Alice Springs. Well, coming up after the break, how woke is too woke? Wait until you see Disney's latest controversial hire for its new Star Wars film. It's coming up. Well, when Dr. Claudine Gay was appointed last July as Harvard University's first ever black president, she told faculty, "This is crazy." She meant crazy as in crazy exciting. But in light of what we now know, numerous allegations of plagiarism, it was crazy as in a stupid decision. Harvard's first black president yesterday added Harvard's shortest serving president to her resume, out of the job in just 5 months. Claudine Gay is just the latest example of someone hired for their ability to tick a diversity box rather than to do the job. Others that come immediately to mind include Joe Biden's appointment of the US Supreme Court's first black justice, Judge Ketanji Brown, who didn't know what a woman was.
Can you provide a definition for the word woman?
Can I provide a definition?
Mm-hmm.
No,
Yeah.
I can't.
You can't?
Not in
Okay.
this context.
So you
I'm not a
believe the meaning
biologist.
of
And Joe Biden's appointment of the second black woman and first openly gay White House press secretary, Karine Jean-Pierre, who, when faced with tough questions from the media, prefers to disappear rather than answer them.
Explain why the president interacted with so many of his son's Ford business associates. More than half of voters told CNN they believe the president was involved and he lied. You can't have a response to that, Karine?
Now, to be clear, the problem wasn't that these people were black or women. The problem was that in each instance they were championed because they were black and because they were women, rather than because they were competent. Joining me now is author and filmmaker Phil Cook. Phil, this obsession with identity politics is doing great damage to America, isn't it?
Absolutely. You know, we see it all the time. Although I have to say, James, we're having a little bit of a turning point. I have a friend who's a high-level executive at one of the biggest job hunting sites online here in America. A year and a half, he told me the biggest job opportunity in America was chief diversity officer. Every corporation in America wanted to hire one. Now, a year and a half later, it's dropped like a brick. They are dumping their DEI departments. They're dumping their chief diversity officers. We're really seeing a change, hopefully.
What's precipitating that change? Why the sudden turnaround?
I think so many, I have to say, so many absolutely ridiculous things have been happening that the general public sees that all that virtue signaling corporations were trying to do back then just has no basis in reality. I think the editorial you may have read that, the former president of Harvard wrote in the New York Times today really was ridiculous, And I think people are starting to see that this just doesn't make sense and we've got to do better.
Well, speaking of things that don't make sense when it comes to identity politics, although I guess nothing about identity politics makes sense, but I want to get your thoughts on Disney handing over the $67 billion Star Wars franchise to, can you believe this, a Pakistani feminist activist.
Also the first woman and the first person of color to direct a Star Wars film. It's set to be released in 2026. You can say that the force is strong with this one. Here's Sharmina Beit-Chinoy.
You know, I'm very thrilled about the project because I think what we are about to create is something very special. And we're in 2024 now. And I think it's about time that we had a woman come forward to shape the story in a galaxy far, far away.
Phil, you're a film director. Tell me, how exactly does being a woman of colour make you a good director for the Star Wars franchise?
Well, that's one of the very, very many qualifications it takes. I mean, you have to be a great director first. But it's interesting that in her case, she has a long track record. She's done a lot of films, but one of the things she champions is making men uncomfortable. She said that at a number of conferences and a number of talks that she wants to make men uncomfortable. But if your target audience is young men, which the Star Wars franchise is, why in the world would you want to make that audience uncomfortable? It doesn't seem like a great fit for a project like this. And after the Marvels, after Lightyear, after Wish, Disney's failed on so many accounts. It's just interesting they're keeping at it.
Well, here she is talking about how she does love to make men feel uncomfortable.
I like to make men uncomfortable. I enjoy making men uncomfortable. It is important to be able to look into the eyes of a man and say, I am here, and recognize that I am working to bring something that makes you uncomfortable, and it should make you uncomfortable because you need to change your attitude. And it's only when you're uncomfortable, when you're shifty, when you have to have difficult conversations that you will perhaps look at yourself in the mirror and not like the reflection, and then say, maybe there is something wrong with the way I think, or maybe there is something wrong with the way I am addressing this issue.
Phil, I can't wait to buy my ticket, go to the cinema with my popcorn and see a movie directed by a Pakistani feminist telling me everything that's wrong with the way I think.
Challenging me to look at myself in the mirror may be good for some movies. I'm not sure it's why I go to a Star Wars movie. I want to see space aliens. I want to see attacks. I want to have fun. And so, I don't know, it just doesn't seem like it's in sync with what the nature of that movie franchise really is about.
So riddle me this. What did Disney gain by this?
It's interesting. I had lunch recently with a film studio, a former president of another film studio here in LA, and who said that, you're attracting young, creative people. Many are far left, many are gay, there's a number of trans people on the team. When you start and they hire their friends, suddenly the momentum of that many employees in your organization is going to start things moving in a different direction. And they don't seem that concerned about profit. They can seem more concerned about making a social statement. So like you said, it's not about being white or black or some other race. It's not about being gay or trans. It's just about, this is not where corporations need to be going. Recently in America, during Gay Pride Week, I was on an airline that made a huge deal about celebrating the gay experience, celebrating the gay community. And they spent millions and millions of dollars doing it. And I thought at the time, I wish they would spend those millions of dollars becoming a fantastic airline. That's what I'm really concerned about when I get on that plane.
Well, what you say is completely correct, because Disney's stock price is down more than 50% since early 2021. And the company recently admitted that its goals for environmental and social change were, get this, misaligned with its customers' preference for entertainment. In other words, they know their woke fetish is a losing game, and yet they persist.
We keep making the same movie over and over and pandering to everyone, but suddenly it's not working. Then we've got to pander harder.
At what point, Phil, do companies like Disney become derelict in their responsibility to shareholders?
I think it has to hurt. I think it absolutely, I think the culture has gone so far in that direction that it's going to have to hurt. Now, Disney is hurting already. I saw something recently that the theme parks were their only profit center these days. And when that happens, shareholders, board members start getting upset. So hopefully we'll see that sooner or later, but I worry that we're going to see some serious damage before they start to shift.
And what about the dereliction of major institutions in their responsibility to the public? Let me show you a man, Colonel Bree Fram of US Space Force. He identifies as a woman, talking about how inclusion is now a matter of national security.
So inclusion is a national security imperative, because you can bring people in, and if they don't feel safe to speak up, if they don't feel safe to bring their full selves to work, you're not going to get the value of the diversity.
Phil, to me, the problem here is not the trans person. It's the military's focus on niche projects like inclusion as in and of itself a priority. Is that not right?
Here in the U.S., the Wall Street Journal today reported that our missile production is down. And the U.S. is facing two serious fronts in war here in the U.S. And so I think that your priorities shifting from military priorities to trans priorities, something's wrong there. And I think the public is seeing that this is absolutely ridiculous. I want a great standing army, and I don't think inclusion is going to be a national security concern in the near future.
Absolutely agree with you, which raises this point then. Does the whole identity politics obsession only end when Disney goes completely broke and America gets beaten on the battlefield? Do things have to get that bad? Or, as you said earlier, do you think there's green shoots of sanity starting to be seen?
I hope so. I'm starting to see more and more indications that people are starting to push back. We've seen it at Harvard. We've seen it at other places recently. And hopefully the whole DEI institution out there, the diversity thing, is being exposed for what it really is. And I'm praying and hoping we can turn things around before we get that far down the road.
Phil Cook, thanks for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, James.
Well, after the break, a US court has finally released new documents naming more than 150 people associated with notorious sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. Welcome back. Joining me now are Sky News contributors James Bolt and Kosha Garda. To the big news of today with my panel, documents from the Jeffrey Epstein case have been unsealed, revealing the names of more than 150 people connected to the sex trafficker. Some of the big names in the documents include Bill Clinton, Prince Andrew, Michael Jackson, David Copperfield. Kosha, I want to go to you. This is a really significant names that are mentioned in this document, but have we really learned much?
I would say not really. So there are, longer list of names, some new ones potentially that weren't in the ether before. There are some more salacious details that come out every time something around this case emerges. But the real story behind the story remains highly invisible. And that is, how did an operation of this nature and this magnitude go on for as long as it did? Why were charges never brought before they were? When they were brought, why were they brought to the lowest possible criminal standard as opposed to other things that he could have been charged with, such as trafficking underage minors and things like that? Why were all his properties not raided right away? Why did the safe go missing? Why has not a single accomplice, such as the people that you've been named, get charged with anything, co-conspiracy or being an accomplice? And when you put all of that together, I think it just explains why people don't trust all manner of systems here, including the justice system, the media, with how it's been covered it. And it feels like a little bit like a cleanup job, I think, to a lot of people, that you're getting a little bit of crumbs here and there, but not the true reason or nature of this case.
Just before I go to James Bolt, what do you expect is the next stage in the Epstein saga?
I think we might just get little drips and drabs of things like this when somebody sues to have more files released. But I actually don't know that we've seen any evidence that any of these co-conspirators, particularly these people named that have come out today, are going to face any sort of justice in any way. And I think as time goes on, it'll probably just get swept under the rug.
James, the one thing we did learn from these disclosures is that the person who didn't do anything wrong is Donald Trump.
Yeah, one thing I would say about this, it's very weird how many people are just using his private plane. Like, it's just like, he's using that private plane for travel from America to Africa. It's, even if you don't know anything, even if everything takes you off guard from then on, it's just weird behaviour at this point.
You'd think you would ask, who is this guy?
Where does he get the money from? Why does he keep hassling me?
How does he know all these people?
Why does he name drop so many different people?
Absolutely, yeah. Exactly. All right, well, in other news, Australia and the Allies have put out a press release warning rebels in Yemen that there'll be consequences if they don't stop attacking ships in the Red Sea. James, Australia didn't send a ship, but we've signed a press release.
Yeah, I was going to, you stole my good line there, but it was just... the only thing that could be possibly more dangerous for Houthi rebels is an actual warship that would have probably, thrown the cat among the pigeons a bit more than just a strongly worded letter, to quote Team America.
Kosha, I want to talk to you about this scandal with Qantas and Anthony Albanese. It's funny, this week Anthony Albanese's been all irate because cabinet papers from years ago have been kept secret as to the reason Australia went to war in Iraq. Have a look at this.
Australians do have a right to know what the decision-making process was, and my government believes that this mistake must be corrected.
So, OK, fair enough. But now Anthony Albanese's keeping secret his meeting with Alan Joyce, boss of Qantas, and not revealing what they talked about just weeks after Qatar was blocked from having more flights. This is a bit fishy, isn't it?
Yes, I think that juxtaposition is very well placed, and we know that the principle of what he's stating, I think, is a good one. More things from the government should be in the public domain, not less. However, it's hard to believe that principle is real when you turn around and see another example where these closed door meetings that happen in private, aren't released into it. It does smell a little bit fishy, and I know that there have been other instances where the administration does fight Freedom of Information Act requests and so on. So I guess that will continue, but it is interesting given what he just put out there for the Iraq papers just yesterday, to your point.
James, Anthony Albanese would have been hoping this thing was dead and buried. Brand new year, new start, and yet here's this thing. It's still lingering around the government.
Yeah, just like the detainees. One thing I would say is let's take Albanese at his word that he was never actually lobbied by anyone from Qantas or by Alan Joyce, despite all these meetings he had with them. Let's say that's true. How influential is Qantas that they can meet with him this many times, never even bring up the Qatar Airways decision, and just sit there patiently knowing he's going to do exactly what they want anyway? So it's a pretty damaging look for Albanese if he's telling the truth the whole way. That it just shows that he's just completely in just wanting to make Qantas happy, wanting to keep them satisfied, and not putting the Australian public first, putting international airfares first.
Yeah, you're right. I don't think the opposition are going to let go of this. They're going to keep pushing and pushing. And fair enough. Well, overseas now, the former US President Donald Trump is attempting to overturn the decision by the states of Colorado and Maine to remove him from the ballot in those states. He's asked the Supreme Court to weigh in. Is he likely to succeed, Kosha?
I think most legal scholars believe yes, and these cases were going to be headed to the Supreme Court anyway, either on appeal or this way in an expedited fashion. He's got multiple layers of defense that his defense team is working on. One is presidential immunity, which is that you cannot prosecute presidents for past actions that they took while they're actually in office. That defense has been out there. One is that there is no mechanism actually for states to remove unilaterally federal candidates from the ballot of a federal election. One is that the 14th Amendment provision requires an act of Congress. It's not something that unelected secretaries of state or judges can unilaterally do, and so on and so forth it goes. So what is this really about? It's about the political angle, using the justice system to create sort of a political overhang. And, who knows? It's a high stakes maneuver. I think that's what all eyes are on, where either on the one hand, it's galvanizing a lot of support around him, including with people who don't like him and never liked him because they see this for what it is, political persecution. And then there's, on the other hand, people are going to find him just a little bit too much if he does get convicted or taken off the ballot, and they just won't be able to ultimately vote for him. And I think that's the calculus that both sides are making, and we'll have to see how it all unfolds in the end.
Have a look at this headline. If we're coming up to the third anniversary of the January 6 riots, check this out. Biden campaign casts Trump as threat to democracy ahead of speech on January 6 anniversary. That's rich with irony, isn't it, James? You've got the Democrats trying to prevent Trump from even being on the ballot paper, but Trump's the threat to democracy.
Yes, exactly. I think also what this is, I think the fact that the Supreme Court is going to overturn, might overturn this, is part of the plan. I mean, the left and the Democrats have been taking a numerous amount of losses in the Supreme Court recently, thinking about Roe v. Wade, thinking about student debt loans. Now, if you can also start to paint the Supreme Court as these MAGA opportunists that just want Trump everywhere and they're trying to get Trump over the line, you give even more weight to this growing idea that they need to stack the courts, that the courts have become Republican arms and they need to start stacking with Democrat appointees. Now, so because I think in a head-to-head race, Biden would win, I think if Biden does win and if this Supreme Court decision does get overturned, we're going to see a lot more arguments about we need to expand the Supreme Court, Biden needs the keys to decide who goes on it, and we need to make sure that the Democrats get their say on the Supreme Court. And I think that's going to be the lasting issue much longer than this simple case.
All right, really quickly before we finish, the United Nations have chosen a transgender model to be UK champion of women. Kosha, can you believe this? Can the UN have any less credibility?
And beauty pageants are doing it, and sports is doing it, and movies are doing it. Why should the UN be left behind? It's just another continuation in this trend that we're sadly seeing.
Indeed. James, your thought?
She once tweeted suffragettes were white supremacists who were fighting for white women's rights. I'm not sure that's the inclusive message you want to send to all British women.
Indeed. Well, James, Kosha, thanks for your time. That's all from me. I'll be back tomorrow night, but up next is Encore of Part 2, Piers Morgan's award-winning interview with star footballer Cristiano Ronaldo. That's coming up.